to get started. My name is Madeline Morrow. I am a past president of the CNPS Santa Clara Valley chapter, and tonight's talk is From Trails to Gardens, Celebrating Local Native Plants by Stephanie Morris. I'd like to welcome everyone who's new, who hasn't been to one of our talks before, and I encourage you, if this is your first talk of ours you've been to, please let us know in the chat how you got here, and welcome. And for those who don't know, CNPS is a nonprofit environmental organization, and it's been around since 1965, and now it has about 10,000 members in 35 chapters over the whole state of California and into Baja California, which is also part of the California, as they say, floristic province. Our chapter covers Santa Clara and southern San Mateo County. And the mission of CNPS is to save California's native plants and habitats. And we bring together science, education, conservation, and gardening, which are all parts of the native plant movement. We encourage you to join CNPS if you're not already a member. Every member helps make the movement for native plants stronger, and you get benefits besides knowing that you're doing good. There's two excellent journals, Fremontia, which is more science-oriented, and Flora, which is oriented for general readership, but they both have very accessible articles. You also will get our Blazing Star chapter newsletter, discounts at local nurseries, and more. And you can join by going to the state website at cnps.org/join. And we have a really full program of talks. Most of our talks, pretty much all of our talks, are on Wednesdays. Next Wednesday, we're going to have a garden tour with Janine Penny's garden, which has been a major transformation. She has a really beautiful garden. It will be a very interesting talk. And then one of our favorite subjects this time of year, wildflowers. So Wildflowers of the Bay Area by Andrea Williams, coming up in 2 weeks. Another extremely timely topic, creating fire-resistant habitat, on June 2nd. We're going to have another visit to a native plant garden to be determined, but it will be on June 9th. And a fabulous photo tour of Bay Area rare plants in 9 counties. We'll have that on June 16th. And they keep going. These are just the ones that we have in the next month. So you can find our events on our website and cnps-scv.org or on Meetup, and they are announced weekly on the chapter news mailing list, which is a really great way to stay in touch. We'll let you know about that. We have a nursery for native plants. It's currently closed right now, but it will be open in a few days for orders. You go to our Square site to make orders, or you can find the link right on our website to the nursery. And you order online. You can pick up plants at the nursery or have them delivered. And this is our major fundraiser. And in addition to plants, we also have some of our GNG t-shirts. You can see some of the designs there, and some books. So you can always check any time of day, of course, to see what we have available in the nursery. Oops. And I kept mentioning the CNPS news mailing list. And this is a great way to get all this information. You get announcements only once a week, one email. And to join that mailing list, send an email to the address below there, cnps-scv-news plus subscribe at googlegroups.com, and I'm sure one of my assistants will help with putting that in the chat. So, well, we have a team of people who put on these talks. We have, someone's the host, someone is the Zoom tech in the background. We also have Q&A moderators and YouTube moderators, people who monitor Zoom and monitor YouTube. And we're always interested in expanding our team because, as you see, we have a lot of talks. You don't need a big technical background to help with this. If you can use a keyboard, a mouse, you're able to switch windows and copy and paste between them, you have the capability of being one of these moderators. So if you can help, or maybe even once a month or once every other month, please contact us. The addresses are there on the slide. And just a little housekeeping about how we're going to do our talks. Please mute your microphones unless you are a presenter, or actually, this is for a different kind of talk. We ask everyone to mute their microphones. The questions will be handled by, if you have questions, put them into the chat, either on Zoom or YouTube. Our Q&A moderators will pick those up and make sure that those questions get answered by the speaker. And we expect to finish by about 9 p.m. So that's our introduction, and I want to introduce our speaker tonight. Stephanie Morris has been working in the field of landscape architecture for 25 years. She enjoys creating designs that respond to aesthetics, functionality, and ecology, with emphasis on California native plants, healthy soil, water conservation, and environmentally conscious materials. So take it away, Stephanie.
Thank you, Madeline. I'm going to share my screen. Give it a second to load here. Okay, does that look good to everybody?
Looks good.
Okay, so I'm going to dive right in. So I'm really excited about this topic. I proposed doing a topic like this in December, and it's been a really fun way for me to get out and get some exercise, and I learned a ton, and I'm very inspired to show you just a small portion of all the things I saw, because there's so much more out there that we could talk about. We're going to fit what we can in an hour tonight. So thank you for joining. My inspiration for this talk was really when I first purchased my house in South San Jose, and we moved in and we had this plain lawn as seen in the upper left. And my husband and I were doing a lot of hiking, and we said, gosh, wouldn't it be great if our front yard looked like a little chunk of natural trail in Santa Teresa Park? And so just learning about natives at that time, we planted in our front yard a native plant garden, many of which, as it turned out, weren't specifically local natives, but we were very inspired by what we saw. And we did put in some native yarrow, and we used all sorts of sages, and the habitat value just absolutely soared. And I'd seen different things come to the garden that I never knew existed before, different types of bees. So we were very excited, and I've been trying to bring that to my design work ever since. And so I definitely approached design from the design and horticultural perspective. And as I've gone on, I've learned what the local natives are, and I'm definitely still learning more. So tonight we're going to look at some local hiking trails and the native plants that can be found there. And then I will share photos of these locally native plants and gardens. And we will observe some differences and similarities between wild and cultivated native plants. And before I go further, I wanted to mention very specifically that I definitely do not advocate ever taking any plant from nature directly and bringing it to your garden. So when we go hiking, we are taking pictures, we are taking notes, and we are not taking any specimens, not even seeds, because those plants can be purchased from local native plant nurseries that specifically are growing them based on proper protocols. So just wanted to make sure that was understood. Some of the resources I used were calscape.org, and that helps a person to find out what local plants can grow in your area. You can go to calscape.org and you can enter in your zip code, and it will even categorize them by type of plant, such as trees and shrubs and perennials, and you can get detailed information on what grows in your area. And then I also wanted to share my plant lists for this talk. That is on this bottom link below. It's www.landscapestandards.com. And on that website, I put trail lists of the things that I personally observed from December until now on the trails as I was hiking. This is not a comprehensive set of lists, but definitely a great starting point. And you will see how many of these trails have repeated different plants of the same type come up again and again at different trails. And I'm hoping that over time as I hike, I can continue adding to these lists. I wanted to give a huge thank you to the many people who graciously shared photos of their gardens and invited me to visit their gardens and take pictures. I put the word out on the Gardening with Natives email list and had many people respond. So I credited and used as many pictures as I could. I could not use all of them, but I really appreciate all of those gestures and that support because it's brought a lot to this talk for sure. So the trail locations we're going to talk about tonight, I tried to pick different trails in the area. Alum Rock in the East San Jose area, the Jones, Priest, and Kennedy trails in the South Bay, kind of Los Gatos area, Sanborn Park in Saratoga, and then also Edgewood up in Redwood City. And as I was hiking in different weather and different months, I realized just how lucky we are to have all these amazing local spaces with so many microclimates. And these are just really scratching the surface of the many places there are to go hiking. And hopefully we'll do a lot more exploring and hiking and sharing of that information, because I think this is kind of a unique talk that bridges the hiking activities that CNT offers up in Redwood City. And as I was hiking in different weather and different, oops, sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. So as I was saying, there are many local trails and we can definitely keep exploring them and keep bringing more to this talk as time goes on. So first of all, in Los Gatos, hiking at St. Joseph's Hill Preserve, which I also call the Jones Trail, that can be accessed by Lexington Reservoir, and it can also be accessed by the Los Gatos side. And you can hike up the trail and make a loop. So I started hiking from Lexington Reservoir and hiked up through some chaparral and a woodland and made a loop. And what I love about this trail is it's just a super close by accessible trail. Lots of people hike there, but because it hasn't been grazed, there are so many intact understory native plants. And as I was walking there over and over again, I found more and more things that I just didn't really expect to see growing so close to where we're living. So definitely plant communities are the coastal sage scrub and the oak woodland, two of our predominant plant communities in the area. And even in the dry winter, when I started hiking, I found that there's some really notable native plant aesthetics, and the toyon is one of those species where in the winter, everything else can be kind of dry and brown around it. You can see by this picture, but the toyon is in full berry, is very brightly colored, and is attracting birds. And here's another picture of the toyon with its berries, a little bit more close up. And then here is that same plant in the garden. So in the garden, it can be pruned and made into kind of a large shrub or an upright tree. And it functions as a very great screen plant to provide a blockage of views between you and a neighbor, such as this one here in Ashini Fernando's garden in Sunnyvale is showing, and provides great habitat as well for birds, with the flowers blooming in the middle of the summer and then the berries in the winter. And here's another image from the Jones Trail showing in the middle the California sagebrush, the back right here an elderberry, and this plant here that's not in leaf yet is a mountain mahogany. And then in the foreground, we have a hollyleaf cherry. And I'm going to show different pictures of those in the garden setting as the talk goes on. So first, the Artemisia californica, the sagebrush. And this side by side shows two different sagebrushes from the same trail, just growing in different areas of the trail. There's a lot of different variation in the size of the leaves, how lush the plant looks, perhaps due to variations in soil or variations in how much sun or shade the specific plant gets. And there's a lot of variation in height from, a small 2 to 3 foot sage up into like a 5 or 6 foot tall sage. And you can see the flowers persist on the plant. So this is February, but this is last year's flowers on the plant right there. And then in the garden, here's the same plant. So this is in my own home garden. It's a relatively young plant, only about a year old. And it's quite large leafed and lush with only a little bit of water from this year's rains, which, as we all know, were pretty scant. But it's responding quite vigorously to the rains that we got. And so it looks a little bit more large in leaf size than the ones found on the trail. But then this one here from Jeff Natal's garden in Portola Valley shows a different version, which is a little bit smaller in leaf and also shows last year's flowers persisting. This one's growing underneath a California live oak in his garden with a manzanita here in the background, and really looks very naturalistic, but also has a lot of curb appeal. This is right beside his driveway. Also on the Jones Trail, we will see the black sage, which is a flowering plant that's blooming right now and attracts hummingbirds and lots of different native bees. And this plant, you can see from the way that it's angled in this picture, likes to grow on slopes. That will become kind of a common theme, is a lot of these plants grow really well on sloped situations. And so it can be about a 5 to 6 foot wide or wider plant and 4 to 5 feet tall. And, will just look a little bit dry during the dry winter. And the minute the rains come, it perks right up and then starts flowering by about April. And then here's that same plant in the garden. This house actually is right in Los Gatos, right as you're walking up to where the trail begins on the Los Gatos side. And it's a whole grouping of these sages in the front yard. They're about 6 or more feet wide and about 4 to 6 feet tall and in full bloom right now. Require very little summer water, and you can see they have a nice form without even a lot of excessive pruning. So they're a great, very easy care local native to grow in the garden. And another picture from the trail, back to the hollyleaf cherry. And so here it is on the side of the trail. It's evergreen, so in February it's very lush and full of greenery. It hasn't yet bloomed at this time because it starts blooming right about now, so early May, maybe late April. And tends to have, from what I've seen on the hikes I've been on, a little bit more of a mounding habit. But then in the garden, it grows a little bit more upright. So this photo I took in our dear friend Sherry Osaka, the late Sherry Osaka, in her garden this spring. Her garden persists thanks to the loving care of her family and a maintenance professional who's working on it. And this one is growing a lot taller and provides a great screen between the front of her yard and her neighbor's yard. And here's what that same plant looks like when it's in bloom, and then what its berries look like. So it blooms starting right about now for about 3-4 weeks or a month, and then its berries are in the fall. The berries are actually edible by people, although they're not particularly tasty and they have a large pit, but they're very attractive to birds. And I see honeybees and all different types of bees all over the flowers of my hollyleaf cherry right now. So it's a great pollinator plant. And this hollyleaf cherry, Carolyn Curtis sent me this picture from her garden and her husband, the late Don Mayle, who was a very influential member of our chapter for many years. I don't know if you can see the full top of this, but it's probably about 20 to 25 feet tall. So it makes quite a good tree in time if it's left to its own devices and let grow up. And I have seen them pruned to keep small over the years as well. One thing that's interesting is when they grow to this tree size and you're seeing them from a distance like this, they actually look a lot like a live oak. And then when you get up closer, you can see the difference in the foliage. It has a little bit more toothed margin and a little bit more spikes than an oak leaf does. So also on the trail, kind of growing in among all the plants I've mentioned so far, you will see the sticky monkey flower. This picture was taken about a week ago and it's just started blooming. So it went from kind of a very dormant stage to a very fully flowered stage that you're seeing right now. It often will grow on very steep slopes and in this really kind of rocky, inhabitable almost looking soil, and does quite well that way. When I find that I grow it in the garden, it needs a little bit more soil, cultivated soil to be happy, but it still needs really good drainage. So here it is in the garden. It's this middle one here. It usually grows about 2 to 3 feet tall, both on the trail and in the garden, and about 2 to 3 feet wide. And when it's blooming, it's simply gorgeous and attracts different bees, hummingbirds as well. This garden you can't really see, but there is actually a wall right in front of it that is built up the soil and provided some better drainage for this plant, which is probably one reason why it's doing pretty well here. This garden was shared with me by Kathleen Vermani of Sunnyvale. And this picture I took on the trail, it's a little bit washed out and hard to see, but I wanted to share it anyway because you will often see the mimulus and the blue witch or the Solanum umbelliferum intermingling with each other. So you'll get this mixture of the blue flowering Solanum and the yellow flowering sticky monkey flower, and they're just all kind of billowing all in among each other. And sometimes as a designer, I kind of forget that. I like to keep the plants kind of distinct, but when you're hiking around, you notice how much they intermix and how beautiful that can be to kind of have that rambling nature. So one of my takeaways from this phase of my hiking was that many plants from the coastal sagebrush community are adapted to slopes, and therefore they really need good drainage in the garden. So oftentimes if we don't have a slope in our garden, which most of us don't, we will build up the soil to provide better drainage, and we'll make sure not to plant plants too low in the garden so that water can run off and not build up at the crown of the plant. The next plant that I'd like to share is the big berry manzanita. And this one is a very large, very mature, you can tell by the hiker here, manzanita. It's just simply gorgeous. You'll see them oftentimes having soil eroded from underneath them and the roots are clinging on, and the trees just have this beautiful sculptural quality and are just amazing to look at on the trail. And they also make great garden specimens. This is a young Arctostaphylos glauca, a little bit higher up on the trail. And you can see its berries here, which actually were available for viewing still in March. So I always thought of them as something that you would see more at the end of the year and they would all have been fallen off the tree or eaten, but they were still there in March when I was hiking. And they were really big, so its name is very apt. I was surprised how huge they were when I really took a closer look at it. And here's a big berry manzanita, an Arctostaphylos glauca in the garden setting. This one is in Arvind Kumar's garden in San Jose. It is a 20-year-old manzanita that has been beautifully sculpted carefully over the years to show off its trunk structure, and it's in great health. It's probably getting very little, if any, summer water at this point, which is what makes it happiest. Once it's established after the first 2 years or so, it really doesn't want much water. And you can see its leaves are kind of grayish with the name glauca. That means gray, so the leaves are gray. And it has these beautiful bell-shaped flowers, typical of the manzanita, that will bloom generally in the very late winter, very, very early spring, like February usually, and attract a wide variety of different native bees. Because they're the earliest flower, they're there for the earliest native bees, and also hummingbirds. I have one in my yard that is just a hummingbird magnet and is really amazing for winter hummingbird habitat. This is a side-by-side comparison of the Arctostaphylos glauca on the left on the trail and the one in Arvin's garden on the right, showing how you really can achieve that beauty of the sculptural trunk structure in nature in the garden. And then in front of that is one of the plants you will see growing together with the Arctostaphylos glauca in nature, which is the golden yarrow, the Areophyllum convertiflorum, and that one's here in the foreground, not yet in flower. And I'll show some pictures of it in flower. So here it is on the Jones Trail in February, the one here without the flowers. You can actually see last year's seed pods still on the plant. And then in April here, as it's starting to bloom, you can see the yellow coming out. You can see some manzanita trunks in the background here. And so the flowers starting to bloom right there next to the manzanitas. And this is just as you're walking, like right alongside the trail. I didn't have to go off any trails to catch any of these pictures. And then here it is back in Arvin's garden, now blooming in San Jose in April. And you can see it's kind of a smallish plant, about 18 inches, maybe 2 feet high, and about 2 feet wide, possibly up to 3 feet wide. So it makes a very nice small accent that pairs beautifully with manzanitas in the garden and other small evergreen shrubs, and probably anything blue flowering too. So learning which plants like to live together and understanding microclimates helps us to be more successful native plant gardeners. The companions that I see over and over again are the big berry manzanita with the golden yarrow, and then I see the toyon intermingling with the hollyleaf cherry, the California sagebrush, and the mimulus. So knowing that those collectively like to grow together in nature, we can put those pairings together in the garden and have more success because they're going to want to be watered the same way in the garden. Other plants that I like, which don't maybe get as much garden respect as they should, the Baccharis pilaris, the coyote bush. So here it is in bloom in December. It's another one of our winter bloomers. And then here it is in the garden. So Jeff Natal shared these pictures with me and let me visit his garden and see his many different local natives. And there's a shrub on the left here. And on the right, he has trimmed it up so that you can see the trunk structure. And one of the neat things about the coyote bush is not only its versatility and how it's pruned, but it's a very fast grower. And it's a great habitat plant for a wide variety of pollinators. So I think it deserves more garden use. Here's a really unique way that it was used. Aggie Kehoe designed this garden, and this is looking toward a neighbor's driveway, and it partially screens the cars from the driveway without being too dense or obliterating them. It just kind of tones down the cars. And next to this here in the foreground is this small California buckwheat, which is also local, the Eriogonum fasciculatum. And I will show some more pictures of that later on. So back to the trail, something I did not expect to see was the Western Columbine. So that was really fun. It's blooming now, I took this about a week or so ago. And it has these really beautiful flowers that kind of go up, arch down and nod down, and you can see the yellow kind of coming from underneath. This was in a partly shady area, kind of near the oak woodland. So it probably gets maybe a little bit of sun throughout the day, but a fair amount of filtered light. And the same goes for the garden. It doesn't want to be in the hot baking sun. It wants a little bit of dappled shade under a tree or morning sun, afternoon shade. And in this picture, it's actually growing on a flat area, but this is near the coast. So I took this at Elkhorn Native Plant Nursery many years ago. And you can see from this picture, it's growing much more upright in the flat area. And this is probably a 3-foot high plant, maybe 3.5 feet high. And it can get that big in the garden if given happy soil and enough space and the right conditions. Also is the blue-eyed grass. This is Rhynchium bellum. And this one was growing also in the dappled shade near an oak tree and makes a great plant for the area between kind of where oaks are and where the grassland begins. It mixes really well with lots of our local native grasses and is rather small in scale, so is good to plant near other things that are also somewhat small in scale so that it doesn't get overpowered by other bigger plants because it's about a 12-inch high plant. And here it is in a garden setting. This was designed by Aggie Kehoe and is a mixture of the blue-eyed grass here and also some purple needle grass, the Stipa pulchra, and then some yellow buttercup, the Ranunculus californica. So it makes a really attractive meadow. You can add different wildflowers or perennials for different blooms throughout the year. But I really like this one because it's very simple and it doesn't have too much going on, and there's repetition of the different colors. And they're all plants that you would see growing together locally. I actually saw the purple needle and the blue-eyed grass growing right next to each other on the trail. So this is a really beautiful interpretation of nature in the garden. Next, I'm going to move to Alum Rock Park. This is East San Jose. And what I did was park up at the uppermost parking lot near the Mineral Springs Trail and the Youth Science Institute. And I walked up this riparian area, Upper Penitentia Creek a ways, and then back down. And then I walked up into the hillside here on what was called the Rim Trail. So I saw some very different types of plants and different plant communities on that trail. And it was a fun day because it was raining that day and there was nobody else there. So I had the park to myself and it was very peaceful and really beautiful. So I saw some riparian and oak woodland on the Penitentia Creek portion of the trail, and up above on the Rim Trail, some great coastal scrub plants and oak woodland. And this picture shows a pretty good example of what I would like to talk about next, which is when plant communities blend together. You can see here you have some oak trees, and then next to that, kind of an area of lower shrubs, which is the coastal scrub. And that area where those plants meet is called an ecotone. So it's the transition between two plant communities, and it's the area of highest biodiversity because there's the most species there. There are species from both plant communities, or sometimes even 3 plant communities all blending together. And I like to use this ecological principle of having a place of most biodiversity in the garden by kind of creating an ecotone. So I might have a taller native tree with an open area of medium shrubs from the coastal sagebrush community, and then some grassland plants. And it's really great because birds can come perch on the tree, and then they have open areas to forage, and you have a lot of species in one place, but it's designed kind of to be like a natural ecotone. So I didn't cover all the oaks in our area. There's only one on my talk, but we do have a wide variety of other oaks. I did want to share the coast live oak because it occurs on every trail that I hiked on, and that's the Quercus agrifolia. And also I have a really beautiful garden example from Sherry Osaka's garden. This is a 25-year-old oak that she planted from a young sapling tree and has had pruned over the years. It's got a beautiful sculptural shape and really frames this whole garden. And oak trees are super important to our local plant communities because they provide some of the most habitat for our different butterfly species. You wouldn't think of it because you don't see these bright, showy flowers, which is what we maybe think of with butterflies. But actually the oak is an amazing host plant for butterflies, as well as birds, as well as small mammals. So planting an oak in your home garden, if you have the space to do it properly, is a really amazing way to support all the different wildlife that we have. The other trees that I see on the Mineral Springs Trail and Alum Rock Park would be the buckeyes, and they are winter deciduous. They actually go deciduous quite a bit earlier than winter. They have a really interesting adaptation, which is as it gets very hot in July, they lose their leaves. So that's their way of conserving water and staying alive. You can find them growing like this picture here where there's water really close by, or up on the drier hillsides. And then they lose their leaves and they get them back generally about February. This picture on the upper left shows what the leaves look like when they start to unfurl. It's very, very photogenic and really beautiful. And then the leaves look like palms, palmate leaves. They kind of have different fingers. So they're very sculptural and can be trained in really interesting ways. This one to me looks like a garden tree, but it's a trail tree. This one here is the garden tree. And this is from Arvind Kumar's garden, designed by Aggie Kehoe. This is alongside his driveway and has been beautifully pruned to show the branch structure and leaves to maximum effect. This tree is probably about 12 or so feet tall right now, but still has some growing to do. And then here's another buckeye. This one is up in Portola Valley. And here we see it screening the western side of a house with beautiful views from this window out through the buckeyes. So looking through this leafy woodland area and then providing a little bit of afternoon relief from the sun. But there's kind of a grove of them here. There's one in the front and several more. They're repeated along the side of this house. And then here's one other buckeye that I wanted to share. This I took at the Woodside Library many years ago. It shows kind of a nice full form when you let the tree grow broad and prune it up a little at the base. And then here's what the flower looks like up here in the upper right. It's starting to bloom right about now, just barely, and will be in full bloom in another few weeks. The flowers are quite large. They can be, up to a foot long or so. And they smell to me like grape bubble gum. They're very fruity and unusual fragrance to them. So they're a great showpiece in the garden, probably underutilized a little bit in home native plant landscaping. And some of the parts are poisonous if eaten, so that's something to keep in mind. But it's a great landscape plant. Next, I wanted to share the elderberry, and this was also on the Mineral Springs Trail. This plant also goes briefly deciduous in the winter, usually around December and January. And then by February, it's getting its new leaves again. And this picture, I think, represents it pretty well because it's kind of gangly looking. It's got a lot of branches and they all kind of go the same direction. And it doesn't have a lot of sculptural quality to it sometimes when you see it on a trail. But it can be pretty prolific. It can grow on hot slopes. It's an extremely fast grower. And it's a great habitat plant for birds. And in the garden can be pruned a lot and should be pruned a lot to keep it managed in the space that you want it to be and to keep from having too many repeated branches going the same direction. So this was taken in Jeff Nuttall's garden in Portola Valley, kind of going through a garden gate right past where I showed the coyote bush before and then seeing this beautiful elderberry there. And then here's another one in my home garden from many years ago that shows how it was pruned up into a multi-trunk tree and it's flowering now in this picture. And then the berries here. So the berries are great for birds, a little bit messy. So if you grow it in the garden, I found it to be a problem on my patio. And I also found that the elderberry got way larger than I expected it to be. I was thinking 12-foot to 15-foot tree, and it was more 20, 25 feet and going on from there, and really did require annual pruning. And as it got really big, I had to hire somebody to do that pruning because I couldn't reach the branches anymore. So one of the things that I'm taking away from this section is that we have a lot more pruning options in our gardens, and they allow us to do different sculptural things with plants and create a different aesthetic for the native plants, and take advantage of the ability to prune things to show off their trunks and their qualities to best extent in the garden. So examples of this would be the toyon that I showed earlier, the coyote bush, the elderberry, and the buckeye. I want to talk about soap plant next. So this is more of a meadow plant that I have seen on pretty much every trail I've hiked on. It goes winter dormant, and then you will see it start to emerge sometimes as early as February with these crinkly kind of grass-like leaves. And here, this was in the rain on the trail, and you can see it's just captured the water. and makes a very striking display as it holds the water. So it's about maybe a 12 to 18 inch tall plant, but when it flowers, it gets taller. And this is a picture of what it looks like when it's flowering. It gets to be about 4 to 5 feet. You know, this is probably 3 feet, so it can get 4 feet or so easily. And its flowers are white, kind of small. They bloom in the late afternoon to evening. And I understand that they're also moth pollinated as well. So it's a great addition to the grassland. And the history of the reason why it's called soap plant is that it actually can be used to make soap. The root is dug up and then crushed and then mixed with water, and it actually does make a soapy paste that can be used for soap. Along with that, you will often see the Solanum umbelliferum, the blue witch. This one here is as I was starting up on the rim trail, sort of toward the coastal scrub area, and I'm starting to see sagebrush, and I'm seeing the blue witch with the sagebrush. And this is a smaller plant, usually 3 feet high or so, and kind of like I showed with the mimulus, kind of sprawling in among other plants. And I love it here next to this log. It just looks really attractive, seeing those together paired up. So I could see mimicking something like that in a garden design. Here it is in a garden. This is under an oak tree in Sherry Osaka's garden. So it gets a little bit of slanted sun coming in during the winter months and a little bit of shade during the summer. And she has a Carex panza meadow behind this plant and a manzanita to the side. And then here's the same species planted in Arvind Kumar's garden in San Jose. And this one has really started to sprawl and climb among everything. It's probably about 4 or 5 feet wide by 2 feet or so high, and makes a really powerful display of flowers this time of year. Here's another trail plant, the California fuchsia. And this was taken in March, so it's not flowering yet. And this is one of the few that I'd like to show that flowers later in the summer. And it's got a beautiful gray, kind of velvety texture to it. This is actually growing on a slope. It loves good drainage, and so it kind of just protrudes out of the slope. And here's a couple more pictures of it. So this one on the upper left was a photo taken by Arvind Kumar, also at Alum Rock Park. And the one on the bottom right was taken in a home garden. And you can see them here in full flower, and they're a hummingbird magnet. So they're really amazing for the garden for the late summer to early fall, when maybe not as many native plants are blooming. The California fuchsias are in full force and really providing that habitat for hummingbirds. One thing I've noticed in the garden is that the Epilobium canum, the straight species, can get very tall, sometimes as much as 4 to 5 feet high, and tends to really start to spread with underground roots and come up all over the place in the garden. So I often will use a named species selection, which is a smaller size California fuchsia, unless I have a lot of space to let the big one really go and take up as much space as it wants to have. So I think it's an example of when given garden soil and maybe a little bit of garden, sometimes watering conditions, it will spread a lot more. If it was given no summer water, of course, it would be a little more tame and spread a little less. Another one of our amazing late summer, early fall bloomers is the California buckwheat, the Eriogonum fasciculatum. This is more of a chaparral plant that you would see in some of the hotter trails in the open sun, sometimes on the most barren looking slopes. And it will, you can see here in the garden here, the flower heads from the last fall will persist often over the winter to provide seed for native birds. And then it will start to bloom again, come again the next summer or fall. It can get quite large in the garden to up to maybe 4 to 5 feet wide, maybe even a little bit wider, and about 4 feet tall or so. And it's super low water and very easy care. And here's another picture of it in a garden setting when it's in full bloom. So it starts to look like a little carpet of snow. And the beautiful thing about the California buckwheat is not only its flowers, but its pollinating, its capacity to attract pollinators. It's one of the most powerful plants for attracting late summer pollinators, bees and butterflies, and all sorts of different unique species of bees, some of which I have no idea even the name of them, but this is definitely a magnet for pollinators. Then one of our other local buckwheats is much smaller. It's called the Eriogonum. Oops, this one's mislabeled. Sorry about that. This one should say Eriogonum nudum. It's called the naked buckwheat, and it's a much smaller little plant that has a little tiny bit of leaves on the ground and then spikes up with a kind of a naked stem or a nude stem to a little flower. So this one is mislabeled. It should say Eriogonum nudum. That was my last minute addition, and so I didn't catch the error there. And I like to put a few plants in that are things that you don't often see in gardens, but that I really love to share. This one's the paintbrush, the Castilleja foliolosa. And it's just super showy, harder to grow in the garden because it makes a specific soil relationship with the other plants and the roots around them. But it is possible to do it. Melanie sent me a photo down here in the lower right of her paintbrush growing in her garden with some yarrow. So some native plants are challenging to grow in the garden because of their specific relationships in their natural setting. And paintbrush needs to grow with the roots of the sagebrush, the golden yarrow, or other host plants. Next, I wanted to talk about the Kennedy Trail. And I'm doing several trails in this area because I saw different things on each trail that I really wanted to share that were intriguing and interesting to me. Here's a view from the bottom of the trail looking up toward the oak woodland and coastal sage scrub. This trail goes basically straight up the hill about 4 miles. So if you want a good workout, this is the trail for you. And it does go through some shaded areas. This was the place I saw the California poppy blooming the earliest along the side of the trail. And here's the California poppy in a garden. This is one of our easiest wildflowers to grow and will often reseed itself year after year. Or if managed by cutting it off at the base and leaving the root in when it's done flowering, it can come back up and reflower that next fall and certainly the next winter. So this is Aggie Kehoe's front meadow garden, where she's growing California poppies next to the California sagebrush, along with many other different species of local grasses and wildflowers. And here's another California poppy garden. I took this one from my front yard earlier this spring, and the poppies were very profuse this year, and I did not seed any of these. These are all just returns from previous years seeding and reseeding. So garden soils can often be richer in organic matter and nutrients, leading to potentially more lush spring growth in the garden setting, as seen by the poppies. Baby blue eyes was another plant I saw on the trail, and you can see it here with the crinkly leaves of the soap plant. And this would make another great addition to a wildflower meadow in the garden. There is this kind of whitish pale variety, and there are also varieties that are more deep blue in color. And then I like this trail also because you can see some nice coyote mint. Here it is before blooming. Just looks kind of like a small plant with a little bit of a minty smell. But then once it starts blooming, here it is in the garden, you can see it's got these beautiful purple flowers. Here it is on the left before it started blooming in Arvind Kumar's garden with last year's seed heads still on the plant. And then on the right, here it is after it started blooming. And here's another coyote mint from Jeff Natal's garden, once again before blooming in March. And then here's an example of a close-up of what the flowers look like when it's blooming. And the coyote mint in the garden tends to get to be about 2 to 3 feet wide and about 18 inches or so tall, sometimes as much as 2 feet, and is really great for butterflies in the garden. So another local native is coffeeberry. And one thing I like about coffeeberry is it's evergreen and it almost always looks tidy. It really does not need a lot of pruning to look like it's been pruned. And so here it is, you can see the trail in the picture, kind of growing on a slope once again, but looking pretty tidy there over on the side. And then here it is in the garden setting used as a foundation plant kind of near the base of a house under a window. Tom Lee sent me this photo from his San Jose garden. And it's neat because you can see the flower here. It's not a very showy flower. It's kind of a greenish yellow, nondescript flower. And then the beautiful evergreen foliage. And one thing about coffeeberry is that it can grow in the sun and it can also take some shade. So I showed some different pictures here. One from a sun garden, from Joanne Canau's garden. And then this is more of a filtered shade garden that Aggie Kehoe sent me. So you can see it's a little less dense in this particular garden in the shade. So we can experiment with slightly different microclimates in the garden, knowing that some plants are also flexible in nature with different amounts of sunlight. So coffeeberry, toyon, and mimulus, I often find can grow in a little more sun or a little bit less sun. There's some flexibility there. So going along with this general area, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Priest Rock Trail. I saw some really interesting things on this trail and wanted to share those. This one goes through some oak woodland at the bottom and then goes up into some coastal sage scrub and even gets into some chaparral with some more woody shrubs. And I found some chaparral currant here, which is a great candidate for the garden. I circled it because it's kind of jumbled in the mix and hard to see, but it's growing in this wash where the water all came down on the side of the trail. And then there was this ribes and some juncus, some sedges next to it. And then here is the flower of the chaparral currant. And here's a garden selection called Wonderlick of the chaparral currant, showing what it looks like when it has a little more richer soil maybe and a few more years on it than that one that was on the trail picture. And then a related plant would be the pink flowering currant shown here on the right-hand side, which is actually Ribes sanguineum and makes a really lovely display of these hanging flowers in February, March, and is a great plant for hummingbirds and birds as well. And this is Aggie Kehoe's garden with this nice bench so you can sit and enjoy the flowers. So gardens, like hiking trails, can offer a sense of calm and restoration to our homes. And I know I feel more deeply connected to nature when I see it in my everyday space. And to me, the more local natives I grow, it really enhances my connection because I see them out in the hiking trails and I see them in my house. So here's some common rush, the Juncus patens. And this is situated between two oaks on the trail. And then I wanted to share what that looks like in the garden. This one was from Sherry Osaka's garden, showing what it looks like here in a little bit of a wash that she created with a rain barrel, directing water down to this plant. And it can take water, lots of water in the winter, and it can also take it quite dry. So it's very flexible during different times of the year. Also, mountain mahogany, the Cercocarpus, is quite rangy and can get quite large on the trail, but actually makes a really great garden specimen. You don't see it very often in gardens, but it grows, it's really beautiful because its flowers turn into these really interesting seeds in the fall. So here is a picture of the mountain mahogany at Ashini Fernando's Sunnyvale garden. And this is what it looked like when it was in the seed stage, really catches the light. So it can be trained like that as a kind of a columnar shrub. It can be limbed up a little bit and let to show its multi-trunks. And this is kind of a young one here in Arvind Kumar's garden, but you can see how big the leaves are on the plant he has in his garden compared to the ones that I photographed on the trail. And here right next to it to the right is that Solanum that I showed earlier, the blue witch. So they're growing together, just like you might see on the trail. Also on the Priest Rock Trail was the buckbrush, and it was in full flower in March. So you'll just see this plant just covered in white, and it gets to be quite large. It can get to be 8 or 10 feet tall, and it's just very showy this time of year. So it's one of our local ceanothus. And you don't see it too often in gardens either, but Krzysztof Kozminski was nice enough to share this picture of the one in his garden. It's the one on the right here, and also blooming in March. And then this is a selection of it, the Ceanothus cuneatus variety Snowball that Bill Sundstrom shared with me from his garden in Palo Alto. And this one's about, right now, it looks like about 5 feet or so by about 6 or 8 feet across. So it needs a fair amount of space in the garden. definitely for a little bit of a bigger garden to have its full form shown off to full effect. So when I saw this on the trail, it really helped me understand why we have developed the idea that yarrow can make a good lawn substitute. Because here it is, it's kind of all these little things off to the side, making this lovely little carpet. So yarrow can be trimmed to be kept as a lawn, like here, and it can also be let to grow up and flower. So here it is in the garden setting. You can see it's a little bit more lush and tall here, and this is the flower when it blooms. It's going to start blooming right about now and kind of into May and June, and is great for butterflies. And here's an example of how it looks when part of it's trimmed down and part of it is left to grow tall. So here, what looks like lawn actually is, but then it blends to the white yarrow here in the middle, which has actually been mowed, and then the flowering white yarrow here on the side. So it's great for a perennial garden and great for a meadow, and it stays green almost year round with a small amount of dormancy in the garden in the winter. On the trail, it'll start looking like this. So these same flower heads here that are white will start to go brown toward the end of the summer and be brown all winter until the rains come again, and then it will green up. But in the garden, with a little bit of extra water, it can be kept green for a significantly longer period of the year. It may only have a small amount of dormancy. So there are some options for less summer dormancy in the garden, but be careful to research the plants first, because most plants from the oak woodland and coastal sage scrub communities do better with little or no summer water, because they will potentially have an issue with root rot. Yarrow is one of the ones you can be pretty flexible with it. A few other plants that I don't see often in gardens, but love to look at on the trails and would love to see more of in gardens, would be shooting star, the Primula hendersonii, and here's its amazing flower. And it's growing just kind of out of the side of this hillside, along with these soap plants here. And then the other one would be the warrior's plume, which you would see pretty prolifically on this Priest Rock trail. But it, along with the paintbrush, does make a very specific relationship where it needs to intertwine its roots with oak trees, manzanitas, and madrones. So it would be really neat to see this growing at some point in a garden successfully. I imagine it probably exists in someone's garden. I just don't know yet, but it's for those who want to take on a big challenge. So we'll have two more trails I'm going to cover. First will be Sanborn in Saratoga. I started at the campgrounds, walked up and around through a mixed evergreen forest of Douglas firs and madrones. So the plants here on this trail would be more for slightly moist or medium water, part shade environments. It's a mixed evergreen woodland. And here you see a beautiful madrone cascading across the trail. I was really excited to finally see alum root for the first time hiking on a trail, probably just because I was not looking for it before. And then when I started looking for things, I saw this, along with the polypody fern here in the background. So here's a garden picture of the alum root, a great plant to use in sort of a small scale space with maybe a north-facing house, someplace that gets dappled shade under a tree. And then here's some pictures of what are probably the Heuchera maxima in the background in white, and probably a hybrid Heuchera micrantha in the foreground. There's harder to find the straight species of Heuchera micrantha in the nursery trade, and much easier to find a million different types of Heuchera hybrids. Also the woodland strawberry. So this one was growing right alongside as I walked along, and you can see it's got a lot of leaves here, giving it this great mulch and protection as it grows. The Fragaria vesca. And here's the plant in Ashini Fernando's garden in Saratoga. Actually, I think that should, oh, this is mislabeled as well, sorry. It should say Fernando Garden in Sunnyvale. So this is her garden in Sunnyvale, the woodland strawberry. And she waters this area during the summer, so that's why it's quite big and quite prolific. She has a spice bush actually growing up and shading the Fragaria vesca a little bit. And you can see here one of its little berries. And here it is in flower. So pretty happy in the garden setting, much more profuse. And so in nature, some leaves will often remain on the ground and shelter new plants, and they help provide extra moisture in the summer, and they're basically nature's mulch. So I always educate that we want to have some of our native plants drop leaves and keep leaves on the soil. And other areas of nature, like some of the coastal sagebrush slopes that I've shown, they would remain more barren, and they help provide some bare soil areas that are nesting options for ground-dwelling bees. So I think about that deliberately when I'm designing a garden and how and where I'm going to put mulch in the garden. Also at Sanborn Park is the cream bush, the Holodiscus discolor, which will lose its leaves in the winter and then come out with these bright new leaves in the early spring, and can make a great garden plant. This one is by the front door, the entryway at Jeff Nuttall's house. And you can see it's just starting to bud out into flower. And these are last season's flower clusters still kind of hanging on it. But it makes kind of a nice accent plant because it's not too dense and has kind of a sculptural quality. And the flowers here are very attractive when they're in bloom and kind of hang down. Another plant from this trail would be the western sword fern, which I find to be always much more lush and happy on a trail than I've ever seen it in a garden. Maybe it's just the type of gardens I do don't have the right kind of shade or the right kind of moisture. But to me, this one on the trail, and then here it is in a garden I designed, it's hard for me to get my fern to look as happy as that one. But it is a really neat plant for the garden. This one's growing alongside a redwood tree and some ground cover manzanita in a garden in Saratoga. And the polypody fern, which is also stress deciduous, so it goes dormant in the summer and will come back with the rains. You can see all this lush moss here. Is great for a wet, moist, shaded spot in the garden. And here it is in Gordon Ferguson's garden, inhabiting that exact zone. And you can see this growing in huge areas on the trail I went on at Alum Rock Park along the Penitentiary Creek. I hadn't actually ever been on that specific trail, but there are just walls of it growing up alongside the creek. So it's a really fun place to go see it. Another plant of this trail at Sanborn is the hairy honeysuckle. And this one is variety vacillans. It's kind of a very long, tendrily hanging honeysuckle. It's got a little bit bigger leaves than the straight hispidula. And here he's woven it along his fence. So it makes kind of a nice little attractive vine in the garden, not too dense, and you can really see its leaf structure. Another one of the plants that I don't see really available in the garden trade, but is locally very common on our trails, is the Fernald's iris. And it has a thinner leaf than the Pacific Coast iris, and the flowers are a little bit thinner. They're kind of a whitish yellow, and it starts blooming right around mid to late April and is probably still blooming on the trail for a short while longer. But I'd love to see this at some point more commonly available for the garden too, since it's local. And the last trail I'd like to show tonight is at Edgewood Preserve, well known for the local wildflower options that are here on this trail, because this trail has oak woodland, but also uniquely large areas of grassland. So I started down at the lower end of the park near the visitor center and made a loop walking up through the oak woodland, around through the grassland, and then down again through the oak woodlands. And some of the things that I saw along this oak woodland portion of the trail, I will share. And then just a few of the things on the grassland, because I think I was there a little early and it's probably much more full of varying wildflowers now. And also because we had kind of a really low rain year this winter. So I think it probably wasn't its peak year for wildflowers, but I saw plenty. Hound's tongue, which is not only locally native to Edgewood Park, but also a lot of the trails in Los Gatos, down closer to where I live, and was really a lot of different hound's tongue blooming this year. So here it is kind of in a bunch, and you can see it in among the oaks and the grasses here. And then one neat thing is that there's some color variation that you can observe. So the typical plant that you'll see is kind of a blue or bluish purple, but there are some white sports that are almost like pure white with a little tinge of blue that you'll see growing alongside the trail. And then here's the hound's tongue in the garden. So it's pretty similar as far as height and size. And, you know, this one it's you know, slightly different, more bluer color than the one on the trail, but similar otherwise. And this makes a great plant for dappled sunlight or like the north side of the fence. In this specific one, John Edmark shared this with me. He has a north fence, about a 2-foot area, and then a path. So this makes a perfect size plant for that area that's not going to overgrow the space. And then I couldn't resist this one. Melanie sent me this one, Melanie Cross, with the hound and the hound's tongue. So I had to include that one. And then this one's from Gordon Ferguson's garden in Montecito. And it's here in the shade with a nice oak leaf litter all around it, and filtered sunlight in the background. I can't quite tell what that evergreen shrub is, but I think it's either a coffee berry or a toyon, and growing really nicely. And then when hiking, one thing I really noticed, having done this over many months and taking my camera every time, is that I noticed so many more details just because I was trying to notice stuff. And I was taking photos, and I was, you know, using binoculars or sketching, or I just think it's such an interesting thing, because a lot of times I would go hiking in the past, but I wasn't trying to notice every little thing. And I think when you go and you try to notice every little thing, you just start noticing more, which is really enjoyable. And to me, it just blows me away that I grew up here and that I'm still discovering new trails and new things to see on trails, and learning so much every time I hike, and then bringing that knowledge in to inform the gardening design that I do. And I mentioned before about only taking photographs, but definitely wanted to mention it again. Don't take plants, even seeds or cuttings. Go to the nurseries for those. And if there's something you love that you'd love to see, mention it to the nursery, especially some of the native plant ones, and see if there's a way for them to source it. Okay, a couple more pictures before I wrap up. And I wanted to share the buttercup, the Ranunculus californicus, making a beautiful meadow here among grasses and oak trees. And this is a great spring blooming wildflower that's quite easy care in the garden. And as you can see from this garden photo, can be quite prolific in bloom and happiness in the garden, and makes a great mixture as well with other native wildflowers. So here it is with some baby blue eyes down in this lower picture. And Diana Aston sent me these pictures to share. Also, this is from the Carpenter Garden as well. So there was kind of 2 gardens I'm sharing pictures from. And then some bulbs too. Ethereal Spear and Ludix, the Tritolea laxa, and what used to be Brodia but is now Dipterostemon. These are great for grassland and can grow on slopes, can grow on flat areas as long as they have decent drainage. And as Arvin's garden shows here, they do well in the garden and can make a really beautiful spring display. Here they're about, you know, maybe 10 inches tall or so. So kind of a nice small scale flower or bulb to appreciate, and can be mixed in with other things in the garden. Miner's lettuce as well, great for seasonal interest this time of year when it sprouts up with the rains, catches the water on its leaves and is really dramatic and is edible. So if you want an edible native, this is your plant, and can be grown in along your lettuces and things too, and reseeds itself plentifully. And here it is in Sherry Osaka's garden, growing among her other plants in her backyard. And last, I wanted to share silver bush lupin. This one got the most response of any plant I asked for. I got so many silver bush lupin pictures, but here it is among the grassland at Edgewood, and right here next to the connection between the grassland and the oak trees. So right in that ecotone area, in full bloom in March. and another image of it here at Edgewood Park, just blooming with these very large, very profuse flowers. And then in the garden, makes a great display. You can see it's in the garden setting, maybe a little bit more uniform in its shape and a little wider and bigger and profuse in the garden. And here's another great garden photo that Penny Pollock sent me. And then another one from Gail Gordon, also showing a bee on her silverbush lupin. And so I'd always thought this was really challenging to grow in the garden, but I'm super happy to see so many people having success with it. So it was a crowd favorite. And then lastly, this one here, which is it's two of them, but quite large in Carolyn Curtis's garden and Don Mayall's garden. So I wanted to end with this beautiful picture from Gordon Ferguson showing me his garden, which looks exactly like a trail. So it kind of brings closure to the whole trails to gardens and back to trails. And then I would like to share a couple takeaways and a list of resources. So basically we can bring the beauty and functionality of natural spaces to our gardens. That's the main points. And to me, the sites, the fragrances of foliage, all the wildlife, it's all a package deal. And the real take home is that we really just simply don't have enough trails, even though it seems like we have so many, and seems like we have so many wildlands. There really just isn't enough wild spaces to support the birds and the bees, the butterflies, the lizards, and the insects, and everything we need to really have a smoothly functioning ecosystem. And the more we can bring those wild spaces down in among us, intermixing, and have less separation of wild versus urban or suburban, the better, because it really connects us all to nature and it helps keep a habitat corridor connected. So I hope we all are inspired to continue to add a few more local natives to our gardens, or volunteer at a local garden that might be able to incorporate some natives, or encourage local parks to plant local natives. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And here are some nurseries with a good selection of natives that you can go and peruse. And once again, that link to the plant lists, which is landscapestandards.com. And in addition to the trail plant lists, I also have a few other just general plant lists for our area and other information. So since this is going to be recorded on YouTube tonight, this list of nurseries will be available by going back, and you can check out any part of this talk. You can review the plant names, the trails, and these nurseries as you would like. So thank you very much. That is basically ends the official part of this talk, and I will stop sharing my screen so that anybody who has questions can ask them, and then those can be relayed by our Q&A monitor, who is Gladys. Thank you, Gladys.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. We do have some questions. And let me.
I'll do my best.
Okay. We'll start with, there was a question from a design intent is asking about the sagebrush. Is that fire prone?
That is a very good question. Yeah, because I didn't really talk a lot about which ones are and which ones aren't.
Right.
So I know that there's a really good list that Las Pilitas Nursery compiled where they actually burned the plants and timed how long they would take to burn. So for the precise, accurate answer, I would direct you to laspilitas.com, and that's spelled P-I-L-I-T-A-S. But in general, I would say that it's probably fair to assume that most of the chaparral or coastal scrub natives are somewhat fire prone. They tend to be a little bit less so when they're somewhat watered in the garden. It makes them a little bit more resilient. But it's a good thing to think about, especially now that wildfires are a bigger part of even our suburban existence than they used to be. So what I would often recommend is to give a little space between maybe your house and the plants for fire protection. And then maybe we'll learn even more at the upcoming talk about fire resistant landscaping as well.
Yes, June 2nd is the date of that fire resistant landscaping talk. So, yep, definitely. Let's see. So Trisha asks, are the manzanita roots invasive in a yard?
I think it would depend on what you mean by invasive. So will they take over and take over other, like take over other things? Not really. They're not super problematic around sewers, although I wouldn't recommend planting anything, within at least 5 or 6 feet of a sewer line or a water line if you can avoid it. But they're not extremely invasive. They won't take over stuff. They're going to be typical of any sort of large shrub.
Yeah, manzanitas are pretty slow growing, right?
They're pretty slow growing as well. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about manzanitas is people always used to say, "Oh, I don't know if I can wait that long. I love them, but," and lately now I find that I'm encountering more people who say, "You know what? Yeah, I'm willing to wait. I love them. I love them. They are still beautiful even when they're small."
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like many plants that might grow and then come up from the root, manzanitas don't really tend to do that. They tend to kind of stay in the place you put them.
Okay, we have a question from Judy, who noticed the picture of the Portola Valley buckeyes that were very close to the house, and they seemed a little close. Maybe you could explain what's going on there and how you would take care of that situation.
Yeah, I think that was probably owner preference. That was the design by that homeowner. And I think that specific homeowner has got a lot of things packed in his garden and is pretty on top of how he's managing things. So that might not be something that I would suggest for somebody who maybe doesn't want to manage things as closely or pay attention to them. I don't know the specifics of his foundation. But that would be something that I would probably recommend, is to at least consider, like, how close do you plant things? Maybe you've got some things and in time they grow too big and you decide to remove them, but you want to do it and you want to experiment, and then you kind of see what happens over time. But it is definitely a good point and something to pay attention to.
Yeah, and because the buckeyes have that kind of odd nature where they lose their leaves early and then regrow in February, or resprout in February. When would you prune? When would you want to prune those buckeyes?
Probably like most plants, you would do it during their dormant time because it's a lot easier to see what the structure of the tree looks like when it doesn't have any leaves on it. And so generally I would prune things after they've flowered, after they've gone through whatever growth cycle they're doing, and before they're going to initiate another growth cycle. So with the buckeye, it's going to start leafing out, in like around February. You wouldn't want to prune it. You want to prune it before that so that it can leaf out in response to your pruning cuts.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Janet asks, which epilobiums, the buckwheats, would you recommend for the garden?
Oh, for the California fuchsia?
I got that wrong. Yes, epilobium. Sorry.
Epilobium. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. So yeah, I think I might have crossed a name or two in my talk too.
Yeah.
After a while, the brain just kind of. Yeah. So and they're so similar, epilobium and eriogonum.
Yes.
Yeah. So for the epilobium, the California fuchsia, which is the one that it kind of goes back and forth between Zauschneria and epilobium, and we try to track where they are, what they're calling it. I like some of the low growing varieties, like Select Mattole is one of the ones that's from the Mattole River. And there's another called Everett's Choice that's really nice. And so there's selections that are made from other areas around the state, so not specifically as locally native. Although I know that there are quite a number of selections of them, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to know which selections are closest to the Bay Area. I would have to go and kind of research all of them. So yeah, maybe for next talk, we can find out which selections were taken closest to the Bay Area so we can plant as local as possible.
Yeah, it looks like Madeline put some selections in the chat on Zoom.
I think I saw that she put somebody, maybe it was Madeline, put Select Mattole. Yep, Select Mattole, Calistoga's nice, Everett's Choice is nice. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yep. And let's see, Karen asks, do you need to deadhead coyote mint?
Well, no, not really. I mean, the picture that I showed in Arvin's garden hadn't really been deadheaded, and I actually didn't deadhead mine this year. Although I did not end up cutting it back, not because I wanted to deadhead it, but just because it had grown too far onto my path. And I realized I didn't cut it back. And so I did end up cutting it back right before its growing season. So I think with many plants, it's a little bit optional. You could deadhead it. It would make it look a little tidier. It would make it look a little more compact. You may be cutting off some seeds that may otherwise be used by a bird. So it's nice to maybe not have to be too obsessive about deadheading, because you are providing for wildlife. So that's the way to get out of too much work, is I'm providing for the birds, you know. But it will, what's interesting is observing a lot of these plants in, you know, January, February, and seeing how many still had the seeds on them and how they just kind of kept growing anyway.
Yeah, you had a lot of pictures with the previous year's seed heads and then fresh buds coming out.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, where did they go? Did they just fall off? You know?
Yeah. Let's see. And actually, I have a question about Ribes sanguineum. It's very thorny. I got a plant from the CNPS garden nursery, and it's just covered in thorns. Is that?
Maybe, is it the speciosum? The
Maybe
speciosum is very thorny. Yeah,
that's what I got.
And there were some neat Ribes actually on the Edgewood Park Trail that I photographed, and I had originally like 2 hours worth of pictures in this talk, and I had to cut it down. And so that was one of many I ended up having to cut out because I didn't have its garden counterpoint, because I had lots of pictures of the red flowering Ribes speciosum. But the one that I found at Edgewood that was local was it was like a Ribes californicum. So but that is a beautiful plant and good for hummingbirds, and also summer deciduous. Usually it'll go dormant in the summer. Okay. And there are a lot of other local Ribes too, which would be neat subjects for a longer talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Here we go. Judy Fenner, she clarified. She said, Ribes on the gooseberry side are thorny and Ribes on the currant side are not.
Yeah, this one has new and it's not got flowers yet, so we'll see what happens and how it goes. A scary amount of thorns.
They are, sure. They're good barrier plants and good for like protecting birds if you've got cats around.
Yeah. Let's see. I don't think we have any other questions. No, unless I missed some. Let's see. Oh, can you just deadhead and leave the heads on the ground for the birds, or will the birds only prefer it when it's on the plant?
That is a good question. I can't say I know the answer to that. I mean, I feel like there might be more temptation to it being on the plant, but I see plenty of birds going and foraging around in the soil underneath my plants. So I think it's an experiment that needs to be done.
Yeah.
I saw that there was a post here that said Wayne's Silver, which is a California fuchsia, is similar to Select Mattole, but has silver tone leaves. Our chapter nursery has both. We also have one that originally came from Mount Umunum, donated by the land manager, if you want one sourced locally. That's pretty cool.
Okay. Yeah, and here's a comment about juncos scratching around on the ground, looking for seeds. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all the questions that I see.
Oh, I see somebody ask for the exact URL for the landscape plant lists.
Yeah.
I can type that in.
Well, I put it right below there. Landscape.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I see. You already answered it.
So there's landscapestandards.com, which you told us about, and I think the CNPS site has some resources, gardening resources as well, but that landscapestandards.com is a good place to start.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh,
there's one more question that just came in.
Just came in. It says, sorry if I missed this earlier, Carolyn. Do you recommend deadheading mimulus to extend the flowering season? Sticky monkey flower.
Sticky monkey flower. So there may be others who have better expertise with mimulus than I do. My experience with mimulus has not been super successful, to be honest. I mostly put them in the ground and they last a year or two and then they die. So I haven't had good luck with pruning them and then having them come back the same year to rebloom, but I have been able to cut them back and have them come back, the next season. So if there is anybody on the call who has had that success, it'd be good to know.
I have, in my experience, sort of pinching them back will help them bloom again during the same year, usually. And in my experience, the best way to get them to flower for a long period of time is to grow them in a pot.
Yeah.
Because I think they really like good drainage. So you can't, Dee said you can't prune into dead wood, so you can kind of pinch back the tips and they will tend to have more flowers. But I don't prune mine in a pot. It's actually, if you see my picture, that's the one I have in the pot. It's one of the jelly beans, and it blooms 10 months of the year without pruning.
Nice. Yeah, the jelly beans, those selections do tend to be a little bit better
but it's much happier in the pot than it was in the ground, no matter how good an area of drainage I try to find. So if you're having problems with monkey flowers, I would suggest try a container.
Okay, good idea. Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because there are some natives that once they get established, you can just coppice them to the ground and they're fine. Like the California fuchsias are like that. They benefit, but other things like the monkey flower, not so.
Is jelly bean a variety or
jelly bean? Yeah,
it's a selection. I don't know if it actually counts as a hybrid because
it's a bit of a hybrid. Rick Pershoff, who passed away several years ago and had actually done a talk for us, was the developer, and he developed a whole line of them. So they're very colorful. They were actually a patented a set of selections, but the patent ended actually last year. So you'll probably be seeing more of them in nurseries now. We actually we don't carry it at the chapter nursery, but we're planning to add it back in. So in the next year, you'll probably be able to get it at our chapter nursery, but they really are gorgeous. He had such an eye, and they come in a rainbow of colors, very vivid, and you can find them in a lot of nurseries around here.
Yeah. Oh, I saw that Judy, she corrected me that soap plant is not moth pollinated. So thank you.
Yeah, it's actually
really, they like it at night, but it's a lot pollinated by carpenter bees and bumblebees during the day.
And it's actually really cool because, only one flower opens on a stem per night, and it happens right around 4 o'clock, and the bees will actually hover around waiting for the flowers to open, and then they come right in.
Come on, we're ready. Dinner time. Nice. Very cool. And then of course, I think Judy also mentioned the bees love the coffee berry flowers, which is of course fantastic. Nice. Anything else from you two?
I don't see anything else. Somebody did mention something about the holly leaf cherry being a keystone species, kind of like good for habitat and all that. Maybe you could comment on that.
I looked that up too, because if you don't have room for an oak and you don't have enough water for an arroyo willow, holly leaf cherry, if you want a large shrub or small tree, is I think up there in the top 5 in terms of hosting the most numbers of butterflies and moths, and it's also a huge pollinator magnet when it blooms. So I think it's safe to call it a keystone species, and more people should grow it.
Yeah, and it's a very easy care plant as well. It doesn't take a lot. It's not finicky, and it can be pruned in a wide variety of different ways, and can be, a lot of times we look for solutions in landscape design that don't really exist in nature, right? Like screening out views and providing privacy, and so it can do some of those functional things as well as the wildlife support.
And you don't really have to wait for any particular season to prune it. It's really amenable to pruning.
Yeah, it's pretty flexible. Yeah, definitely. So you'll have to pull out some seedlings if you grow it, because it does tend to, all the little cherries that fall on the ground do tend to sprout. So I'll usually spend a few hours kind of just quickly pulling out the seedlings. They're not hard to pull out if you do it when they're young, especially.
Yeah, that's a good like April activity.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm excited that I finished right about at 9 because it was a lot of plant pictures. I knew I was packing in a lot there, but I wanted to share as much as I could because there was a lot more that I could have shared. And so I appreciate everybody hanging in there, and thank you for attending and for all the good questions. And I'll pass it back over to Madeline in case you have any last words before we sign off tonight.
Well, I just want to thank Stephanie for sharing this amazing talk. And if you want to copy the chat, down at the bottom, there's 3 dots. And if you click that, you're able to share it. And there's a lot of kudos in the chat, Stephanie, so you should save it and take a look. And we hope to see you all at our other presentations. And the next one is next Wednesday if you're interested in gardens. I think it's going to be a great presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, and thank you to CNPS for supporting these talks, and for everybody who's putting in all this work to host all these talks. And it's just a great community. It's a great thing that we're being able to have these saved to YouTube so we can go and check out this resource over and over again and share these talks. So I appreciate that very much.
Okay, good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. See you next time.